So I've been asked to talk about data management in clinical trials. I'm a neurologist and I work in Calgary. My interest is in stroke, and I've been involved in clinical trials in various manifestations, both large multi-center randomized trials and also smaller studies and cohort studies. And so some of the comments arise from my experience and over time, and happy to hear what other people have experienced as well, since I think a lot of this has evolved quite a lot in the last 15 years and 20 years really with the evolution of electronic data capture for collecting data. So I'll start, and then please type or ask questions as it arises, and or if after the fact, if you're watching this in a delayed fashion through the video, then if you want to email me and send questions, you're welcome to do that. I'm at the University of Calgary. Okay, so I was going to try and emphasize the following 7 points. Talk a little bit about introduction to what is data management, why is it important, what are the options for instituting a data management solution, using the data you get to help you manage your trial as it's happening, and I have some examples from recent trials. Talk a little bit about data preparation, how it's recorded, what's required, and then setting up your database so that you're using the theoretical advantages of electronic data capture to make your data as high quality as possible. And then I'm going to talk about regulatory guidelines where there are guidelines and where there are gaps. And then the final thing I'm going to talk about is the user experience, something which is so often neglected. So first of all, sometimes data management is sort of seen as the boring part of running a trial, but obviously it becomes critical. If you have poor data or poor data quality, then you are in trouble at every single level of your clinical trial endeavor. So what is it? It's the mechanisms that you use to record and store your data, the quality control that goes along with it, and hence the operating procedures or the protocol that you have in place to ensure that you have reproducible and reliable data. And then I think it's really using the data to help you manage your project. And I think that this is true even in the beginnings of randomized trials when data were collected on paper. It was still all of these four things were critical principles. And the evolution to the use of computerized systems and electronic data capture has resulted in or evolved to allow us to use the internet to collect data in real time, to check for simple typographical and logical errors in real time, and to try to use the computerized systems to increase the quality of the data. So that's what data management is. Why is it important? Well, if you're obviously it depends on the objectives of your research, but fundamentally you want to have accurate and reliable data at the end of your trial. And so if you know that you've had a good process of data collection, there's been quality checking along the way, and you are confident in the mechanisms of storage, by the time you get to the end of your trial, then you will be confident that you can make the correct conclusions from analysis of your data. If obviously the data are poor in quality, then conclusions that you make may be false or inappropriate, and that's the fundamental issue in managing data. So there are the simple way, if you're doing a single center study and you're just looking at, say you're doing a chart review of 200 patients with heart failure in the last 6 months that have visited your institution, and you are looking at the charts and then entering data or collecting data in a spreadsheet. So I put one down here just with some mock variables in the bottom right hand corner. Then the risks are, and I'm going to switch over to a spreadsheet in a minute. The risks are that you may not be able to audit what's happened and what's changed. It's easy to make typographical errors. You can be looking at row 4, entering something in row 5, and not be able to to be sure that you're entering the right data. So it's easy to make both errors in logic. It's easy to make errors of omission. And so for example, if I switch to a spreadsheet here, which I've got, I'm going to make it bigger. If you have a spreadsheet like this, which is the one I just showed you, it's easy for you to be say, okay, I want to work on patient 8, or I want to work on patient 9. You go to row 9, but it's actually patient 8, and you want to change the code. If I change it to 14 or 20 or change it to 24, I may have put it in the wrong place, and there's no way to audit or check that in a simple spreadsheet like this. Now, there are some things you can do. I mean, it's still true that for some aspects of data collection, it makes sense just to put it in a spreadsheet and do the best you can. And so it's useful if you're starting out in your career, you're a resident or a medical student, to learn how to use some of these things. So, for example, if you wanted to, well, let me just first click, because I'm a neurologist and I have obsessive compulsive tendencies. I have to correct spelling, but here you go. So if I was going to change this, so say I wanted to make sure I was going to enter yes or no in this column, you can go to data in Excel. You can go to the data, and under the spreadsheet, you go to the validation area, and then you can decide what you're going to put in. So you could, for example, have a list, and you can have yes in here, or say we say true and false. I believe it's a comma separating them. And now what happens is when I go, I have a pull-down list for true and false. And that is that's just a simple way you could use to make sure that you are putting the right data into your spreadsheet. This is a way to deal with the problems inherent in entering data in spreadsheets and logical errors. Similarly, you can, using the same tool, you can put limits. So you could say, this is in code 2 here. We could go to validation, and it's going to be a number. So it's a number here, right? But we could say it has to be between 0 and 1,000. Okay, something like that. So that if I went here and I tried to enter 1,001 or 10,001, it would say I get an error message, and it won't let me do it. So these are the kinds of things you can start to do in Excel, a simple spreadsheet, and it's true for other spreadsheet programs as well. If you're using numbers in the Mac operating system or another spreadsheet system, you can do this kind of thing, and it becomes very useful when you're doing simple data collection to help you avoid the logic errors or the dumb omission errors, or just the you're tired and you're entering stuff in a spreadsheet. To make sure you have high quality data. So I would encourage you to if you're doing a simple project, that's the kind of thing you do. And I teach the medical students and the like to do that kind of thing when they want to collect data on 10 or 20 patients, that kind of thing, to avoid it. Now, the next step up is to start using database programs. So simple ones that people will know in the Microsoft world are Access. There's an old one. I don't even know if FileMaker is still more widely used, but using SQL Server-based database. These are simple database solutions. They're limited by the size, but ideal for relatively small projects. And essentially what you can do is you can program logic within them. So you can just like I showed you programming limits on the dates, you can start to program logic which is related to different data points. So if you're collecting the follow-up, the date of the follow-up visit, it has to be greater than the date of the entry into the trial, or there are some rules about how the trial is run. You can program information in there so that simple typographical errors cannot be made in the database, and then you're going to get higher quality data. One of the solutions that's been very commonly used recently is REDCap, and this comes from UVA, and essentially it's an open source system for collecting data. It's essentially a relational database designed around the clinical trials concept. So there are some structural features of the database which are related to collecting health information. Some of those provide limits, right, on what you can actually do and what you can't do. But it's simple, it's very easy to learn and use and program. And many of the universities across North America and even around the world have installed this or made instances of REDCap available on their research infrastructure so that you can enter and control data yourself. You can design the database and then control it yourself. This screenshot here just shows you an instance of the REDCap system in Calgary, but it's available. It's not, at least in most situations, it's great for doing a prospective cohort study, or you're doing a chart review and you want to collect data or that kind of thing. You can step it up and it can be used for randomized trials. They've been slowly increasing the capabilities of REDCap. It is possible to have an instance of REDCap that is potentially appropriate for regulatory level trials, but it's not ideal, and I'll get to that in a minute. So there are other ones as well. So the Open Clinica is an open source database. Here it is. Here it's openclinica.com if you want to go and have a look. Obviously, this is a private company that makes this. So you have to buy the software, and again, it's got a number of tools for helping you organize your data, and then also a lot of built-in thinking around how you organize your clinical trial management, so that you can do the things you need to do for the trial. For example, managing safety events, managing your DSMB, doing interim reports, and things like that. The one that has achieved a lot of usage in Canada, particularly because it was developed in Hamilton, is iDataFax. It's recently been sold off to a company that's now works out of Seattle, but it's a system which we also have this and use this system in Calgary, and others have adopted it as well. It's been very successfully used in multiple clinical trials. And this is a regulatory level software. So what that means is that key regulatory agencies, Health Canada, FDA, EMEA, have looked at the software and agree that it meets their standards for ensuring validity, particularly auditability. So nothing is ever lost, right? And they could always go back and look at it. And when it's properly installed, then you can be and used in the right way. You can be sure that if you were going to do a trial which required regulatory compliance and regulatory level data collection, using a tool such as that would be acceptable to the FDA for a submission of those data for marketing approval consideration. And then there are a number of other large trial databases which are available commercially. Most of them are based on Oracle, the Oracle database platforms. And again, a lot of that has to do with incorporating logic into the possibility of incorporating logic into the system, so that you can manage some of the safety and the processes, auditing, et cetera, that are required by regulatory approval. And I'll get to that in a minute. So the number of systems you can use, generally speaking, as you're getting into a as the numbers go up, if you have a very, concise or whatever small kind of a project, then it's probably fine for you to do something just simply in Excel or program something in Access, because the level of effort that's required to, goes up as you go down this list on the left-hand side. So the magnitude of your project and then the needs of your project should determine what kind of software you're going to be using to capture your information. So what are you trying to do is while your project is going on? I mean, if you're doing a chart review, well then the completeness of your data depends on how well and how fast you're getting data in as you're reviewing each chart, but it is a sequential process. Similarly, if you're enrolling patients in a prospective study, whether that's a randomized trial or a cohort study, the same applies. Usually there's sequential patient enrollment, and collecting data in a sequential way means that you need to pay attention to completeness. So if you start to have missing data, if you have, say, a 2-site trial, then you start to have missing data on your patient that you saw that was seen last week, then obviously it becomes more difficult to get that data. And as time elapses, the accuracy and the reliability of that data start to fade away because it's not being done in real time. So one of the key things we want to do is keep on top of the completeness of the data. The wonderful thing about having a electronic data capture system is it's easy for you to do that. You can produce a report which says, there's 50% completeness on this patient, or overall at this site there's this many data fields are missing, and you can start to push people and work with them to get their data done right. Similarly, you can also program in the logic so that they're allowed to partially save information. You can program electronic reminders to get stuff done, and all of these things are really important for completeness. Accuracy has two components. So again, you want accurate, high-quality data. And the one component is making sure that you can make sure electronically that there are some limits to data. So, for example, you can make sure that somebody can't enter a hemoglobin of 1,000 grams per liter because we know that that's physiologically impossible. So you can put limits on your data so that simple typographical errors, for example, entering a 4th digit on a hemoglobin value, can be avoided because the computer can say, no, that's not an allowable entry. It looks like you've made a mistake, and you can make sure that it's corrected at the time of data entry. That's one side. It is harder to, and sometimes impossible to correct just errors of logic which are still within the bounds of a given value. So somebody could hit 6 instead of a 9, and you get 60 for your hemoglobin grams per liter instead of 90. And 60 would be a little less plausible, for example. So some of those things you can't check as people are data entering, but you then can flag them at the back end. So your data manager is the person who's going to be looking at the data and will say, okay, well, this is an outlier. There's a hemoglobin of 60 here. Are we really sure that person had a hemoglobin of 60? You can query the result. And again, the systems that if you in using a system like DataFax, you send that you enter a query, it gets emailed to the site, and the site can then respond and say, no, actually you're right, this is a mistake, we meant to enter 90, they can fix it, and then you're back in the normal range, right? Another reason to have completeness and accuracy in an ongoing way is how you're going to use your data during your trial. So for small trials, it doesn't, interim analyses are rarely done, but as the trials get larger or there are particular considerations in a trial, there often are one or more interim analyses in any given trial. So if you have an interim analysis and only 50% of your data are complete, it's basically useless to do the interim analysis because it's an unreliable assessment of where the trial is at. So managing data for completeness and accuracy as you're going through the trial becomes really, really important. Other issues that can happen is you can use your data to help with quality management. So if you are setting a target, as for example, as we have done recently with stroke trials about the speed of treatment, then if the sites are entering their data in a timely way, it's complete, then we can look at their speed of treatment and feed it back to them and say, you know what, this speed was too slow, what happened, or this is really good, you did this really well. So these are you can use the data, the process measures in your trial to help you manage what's actually happening in your trial in real time. And that capability is something that I think is probably really newly evolved. It's really something that's evolving from the fact that we can do electronic data capture now in a widespread way. So it's been enabled essentially by the internet and having data systems that can do this. When you were previously 20 years ago, people are collecting things all on paper or on fax back. It's harder to do that in real time because collating the data is not so easy. Finally, there are interesting trial designs that will demand you have data available for their implementation. So if you're going to do a Bayesian design which is dependent on what's happening in the patient, so in the patient response or in some kind of process that you're measuring, so that what happens next in the trial is dependent on what's happened before, then you better know what's happened before, otherwise you can't do it. So these adaptive designs, for a good example would be a response adaptive randomization process or response adaptive sample size recalculation. All of things demand that you have accurate and complete data at the time you want to make these changes to your trial design or as the trial is running. So the only way to realistically do that is to have a good data system set up so that you can manage the data that's coming in. Here's an example. This is an example from the ESCAPE trial where we were really interested in how well sites were able to look at their imaging for inclusion of patients in the study. So as we did, this is the end result of the trial, but as the trial was going on, we were getting the information from the sites about how they were scoring their imaging, and then we had an independent group look at the imaging in a real-time way, and we were able to see how well they were or how poorly they were making decisions on the imaging for inclusion. Now, the data you see in front of you are the end of study core lab interpretation of the imaging, and we see that we have a relatively low % of imaging protocol deviations, ranging from 3 to 6.5%. And we were very gratified by that because we felt that it reflected the fact that we'd spend a lot of time on the phone with sites and working with them to reduce their imaging protocol violations. And so this issue of in-trial and ongoing data quality management actually worked in making sure that we had the right patients being included in the trial. Similarly, we worked with sites in the ESCAPE trial to reduce their times. And if you look at the top graph, and although there's a lot of scatter around the patient, there's a lot of patient-related variability, we see that gradually over the course of the trial there was a negative slope, a reduction in the time from CT to groin puncture, so in terms of speed of getting people into treatment. And so this was a critical factor in driving the trial forward, and it represented probably a combination of us hammering home on sites that you have to be faster, and we had the data from our data management system. We were using DataFax in this case, but we were able to export those process measures and then use them in a real-time way to try and encourage the sites to be better, and that was really, really important. So when you're designing your databases and your data collection system, you have source documents, and then you need to decide about what those exactly are. And I'm going to show you some guidance on that because there's still a lot of discussion about whether electronic source documents are adequate, and there's still a lot of places which have mixed records. Some hospitals have, for example, and some family practices or practice systems have an entirely electronic clinical record, an electronic medical record. Some have a hybrid where some aspects are electronic and some are not, and some are still on paper. And so the whole question about what exactly is a source document, of course has had, there's implications of the structure of the existing system. So in some cases electronic documents are allowable, and then there of course are privacy issues about who has access and how do you check them and all that kind of stuff. Setting up a workbook can be very useful. So often you take your case report forms and have a workbook which can be used as a source in some cases. But you need to prepare your data and make it easy for people to get the data into the system. How do we set up data checking? So there's an important principle about how so you've got a nice database, you've got your data points that you want to get. I think some key things are to make sure you don't get too excited about collecting a lot of data, because the more data you collect, the more difficult it is to ensure the quality and completeness and accuracy. So if you're collecting things which ultimately you're not going to analyze, or ultimately are not going to help in the running of the trial, or ultimately are unlikely to be used, then you probably shouldn't collect them. And so you need to take a pretty careful and rigorous think about what data elements you want to collect. There's lots of nice things you could collect, but you have to be careful. So this is an important trial design thing to think about very carefully as you're getting your trial sorted out. And then as you design your database, you start to think carefully about how these things work. You may have an idea in your mind that you want to collect X, Y, and Z, and then after you start thinking about your database and how you're going to analyze it, you think, well, maybe we really don't need Z after all, and we'll just collect X and Y. Establishing logic checks in your data. So I showed you how to do those validations in Excel earlier in the presentation. And of course, you'll do the same kinds of things if you do it with Access or FileMaker, or if you're involved in the programming, and you'll often have a person who has expertise in putting that program. But you need to be careful. Too many logic checks in your data will backfire, and it can result in it being too difficult to actually enter the data for a given person, and then you lose your data. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. And no matter how good you think your logic is, often somebody will enter data in a way which you couldn't have even dreamed up in your wildest dreams, and it can result in a logic check being fired, and then the data are not entered, and you lose that moment when the data is going in. So you need to be just a little careful. There's a balance between having logic checks on your data to perform accuracy, and then impairing the actual data gathering procedure and process. Certainly, if you have a logic check which you have ultimately not thought of all possibilities, then it is possible to trigger it in an appropriate setting, then that's going to be a problem, because you have to reprogram your database so that that person at the other side can then get the data in, and that delay can result in you losing data. So there's a balance, and I'm just encouraging people to think carefully about how that process works. So the last couple of things, and I'm going to show you some, I'm going to flip back to some PDFs here, so about regulatory guidelines. And I think that the general approach, just so people understand, the general approach in Canada is that you should follow GCP-ICH. So it's a good clinical practice international conference on harmonization in a general way, and that really applies. They're generally good. They're good principles for doing all kinds of clinical research, whether or not the study that you're involved in is actually a regulated trial under the auspices of Health Canada. So make this distinction clearly. Some studies that you'll do are not regulated. They may be testing a standard of care intervention, or you may just be doing a cohort study to understand natural history. These are studies which don't have to have a Health Canada oversight, and the oversight for studies like that is the ethics board at your institution. But it's still true that I think researchers expect that the principles of GCP-ICH are going to be followed, if not in exact detail, then to a large to the intent of them is going to be followed. Now, if you have a study which requires regulatory control, so that's usually, for example, a new drug or a new indication for an existing drug or a new device, then an application will have to be made to Health Canada, a clinical trials agreement will be reached, and you will get, assuming that Health Canada does not object to you conducting the study, you'll get the NOL letter, or notice of no objection letter, which then entitles you to run your clinical trial under the Food and Drug Act. So the Food and Drug Act is a Canadian statute. Health Canada has a number of regulations under the Food and Drug Act that govern how trials are done, and that act has a number of regulations that tell all the details, and Health Canada has fully adopted the GCP-ICH guidelines, so you can look those up. You must, by law, follow the GCP-ICH guidelines. And in the GCP-ICH guidelines are some guidelines about using electronic data and how data need to be managed. Generally speaking, there are principles of what you need to have done. Some of the details are not as well listed. I'm going to show you some of the things that I've done. Similarly, if you were doing a trial, which is, and often this is the case in Canada because we have the large medical market south of us, the FDA, and the US, the FDA has its own set of regulations. Generally speaking, the FDA also follows GCP/ICH, but they have not formally adopted the GCP/ICH guidelines in toto, so they issue their own guidance about it. And they also have specific guidance about how data are managed and how clinical data should be managed so that it's clearly sorted out. I'm going to show you a couple of things like this. So one of the things the FDA often does, and I'll show you Health Canada ones too, is they will have guidance. So remember we talked, they have these little guidance documents. So you'll see here's a guidance document for industry, and talks about when can you use electronic source data in clinical investigations. So basically, this is a document which talks about some of the issues that come up about, what is a suitable source data in the setting of an electronic medical record. And these documents are in flux, and this is an important concept about our regulatory authorities in health, is that they're also evolving. In the same way that we're evolving methods to better capture data or methods to do trials in new and better ways, the regulatory bodies are reacting to things that are happening and providing new uses. So if people are interested, you can go through and read this. These documents are widely and easily available on the internet, but we could certainly post them if that's of interest as well. So there's one on electronic source data, and I'm just going to go to the other source data, and here's one on computerized systems used in clinical investigation. So this is on software. So they have a whole system here on what do you have to have in your software which you're going to use for collecting data. So what are the standards? You need to have a protocol, you need to have an SOP, excuse me, and you need to have, sorry, excuse me again, so you need to have operating procedures, source documents, how it works, and you need to have an explanation of how your data are entered, what's the audit trail, who has been entering your data. So you need user level security so that they have you can keep track of who's doing what to your data, and you need to be able to keep track of those on date timestamps. So this is the issue of making sure that you have reproducible and auditable data. So if you know if someone's made changes to data, you can figure out what it is at the back end. So there are a number of requirements that you would need to fulfill a data system, which the FDA and Health Canada has a similar one under Division 5. That's what the Part C Division 5, which tells you what the quality of your data have to be. So these things are out there under regulatory guidance. But there are here's one from Health Canada. This one is, here it is, Guidance for Records Related to Clinical Trials, 68, and it's under Part C, Division 5. And this is for drugs, clinical trials, and it tells you it supersedes the previous one, 2004, and it goes through what you need to have, right? The definite overview and how investigators, et cetera, and what happens with the forms. So obviously these are pretty dry documents. They're regulatory stuff, but these are the things you need to know about what data system you're using. And generally what you'd like to know if you're going to use a particular bit of software and then use it properly is that software, or has that software been approved by the relevant regulatory authority in the country that you're operating in. So and then finally here's a really nice discussion here. This is a really nice paper, actually. It's several years old now, but it's from Europe. So it's from ECRIN, which is European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network. And what they put together here is it's a working paper, a white paper. It's mostly done by academics who do clinical trials. Is how do you do GCP compliant data management in large clinical trials? What are the principles you have to adopt? And they got all the people there. And then here's the concepts. So they go through some of the issues, right? And they talk about FDA in particular. And then what are the definitions, computers, how do you train people, what are the procedures you have to put in place, how do you manage safety, etc. What are the important documents you need, and how do you set up your quality management system in the setting of multiple different countries, so that you've got a system which is achieving all of the quality that you want in the end. So in the end, what you've got in a trial system here, ideally if you're doing a regulatory trial, you've got a trial system, but what you're trying to do is collect high quality data which is reproducible, auditable, and at the end of the trial you can be comfortable that the analysis you do is going to be right. And the last thing to recognize here is you must pay attention to the user experience. So whatever database you decide, if you design forms and data entry and this kind of thing, systems with lots of logic checks and all these things, and the forms are cluttered and difficult, you're not going to get good data because it's very difficult to use. And you may know easily how to do it if you've done all the design work, but you must pay attention with any software to what the user experience is like. If it's not user-friendly and as intuitive as possible, you will get poorer data quality. And this is an oft overlooked issue. We can talk about all the benefits of electronic data capture, and we've talked about some of them in this presentation. But if you don't have a system which is easy for the user to use, even folks who don't know a lot about what their the disease of interest and that kind of thing, if it's difficult to figure out what to do without intuitively, you're going to have a hard time. And so getting user testing is really critical, not getting too cluttered, simple definitions, making sure things are consistent between paper and computer are just so important. Otherwise you lose so much of the benefits. And of course, this of course is a people thing. You need to make the machines work for the people, not the other way around. And because clinical trials and clinical research is certainly an exercise in getting people to work together to get good data. So those are some principles or thoughts about how data management systems work. Covered a lot of different ground, but I think a lot of times data management is a topic which is left to the end of thinking about how you're going to manage your project. It's absolutely critical for managing large prospective multinational clinical trials. And without the EDC systems, we certainly would not have the capability to do the trials that we're doing today. So I'll stop there. I don't know whether anyone else has joined, but we're certainly willing to take questions after the fact when this is posted for general viewing. Thanks very much.